So in today's video for 7.2, we are going to be talking about congressional leadership and committees. And ultimately, what we're going to be looking at in this set of notes is looking at how leadership in Congress and their ideological leaning, as well as committees in Congress, affect that policymaking process that we looked at last unit. So the first thing that we're going to do is look at the leadership, who's in charge in Congress, and then we'll move into the first aspect of lawmaking in this video, which is committees, and we'll finish that process in 7.3. First, we're going to look at the leadership structure of both chambers of Congress, both sections of Congress. That's what chambers means. Whether it's the House of Representatives or the Senate, as you can see here in this diagram, we have hierarchical structures, meaning that there's a hierarchy. Someone is at the top, and then as we go down the hierarchy, they will kind of delegate authority and different responsibilities to lower members of the chamber. Now, we're going to go through each chamber individually, separately, but one of the first things I want to note is that out of all of these that you see here in the diagram, there are only 3 that are actually mentioned in the Constitution, and I have outlined those with the stars here. So that is the Speaker of the House in the House of Representatives, that is the Senate, in the Senate, that is the Vice President, and then the President pro tempore of the Senate. And that's it. That's all the Constitution states. But it does then say that each chamber, whether it's the House or the Senate, does have the ability to choose their other officers. And so this is how we get these remaining members underneath this flow chart here. Whether it's majority leaders, minority leaders, whips, conference chairs, caucus chairs, things like that. So at this, one of the things I just want to talk about here before I move on, because I always get questions of how do these specific members, especially Speaker of the House, President pro tempore, these majority leaders, how does all of that get chosen? So at the start of each congressional session, every session starts in January of odd number years, and it's for every 2 years. So this current congressional session started this past January of 2025. The next one will begin in January of 2027. At that starting point, each chamber is going to elect their leaders. The House parties, for instance, will get together. The Senate parties will get together, and they will form what we call caucuses. These caucuses are essentially the name given to a meeting of or an organization of all party members in that particular chamber of Congress. So you're going to hear me talk about that as we go through these next couple of note sets. But what happens is they gather within each chamber, and they're going to determine their choice for the leadership positions that you see here in this flow chart. So, for example, Republicans, for instance, in the House will get together and decide, all right, who do we want, in this case, for, Speaker of the House, since Republicans currently have a majority. Democrats will get together, and who do we want for minority leader, for instance, and vice versa. The same thing happens then in the Senate. They would make those decisions all the way down to these lower positions of leadership, whether it's the whips or the majority caucuses and conference chairs. And one thing to note is that when they do vote these leadership positions, it's almost always, without a doubt, a party line vote, meaning Republicans will vote for Republicans and Democrats will vote for Democrats. And I want to clarify and reinforce one more time what I'm talking about when it comes to majority versus minority. Majority is going to refer to the number of seats that each party has. So if there are more Democratic seats than Republican seats, that would mean there's a Democratic majority and a Republican minority, and then flip-flop that, vice versa. So obviously the majority and minority status is not set in stone. This will change with each election. So don't think about it like the majority leader is always a certain party, minority leader is always a certain party. It just depends on how many seats there are of each party in Congress. Okay, so let's get going with specific leadership positions. We're going to start with the House of Representatives, and we're going to start with that constitutional position, the one that is formally in the Constitution, and that person at the top is the leader of the House of Representatives, and that is the Speaker of the House. Now, the Speaker of the House is always going to be of the majority party. So right now we do have a Republican majority, and therefore our Speaker of the House is Representative Mike Johnson. And he he still is a Republican who represents a district in Louisiana. And I do have a star, as you can see, next to the Speaker of the House here. This is because the Speaker of the House is probably the most powerful member, not just the House, but realistically probably in Congress itself. Now, they are elected by the whole House of Representatives, and this position carries a lot of weight to it. They preside over the House when the House is in session. They will call it to order. They are the one that's in charge of organization of the House of Representatives. And another important role of the Speaker is when the House is in session and when it comes to lawmaking is actually making committee assignments. And we'll talk about committees later in the video. But what the Speaker of the House will do is they're actually really pivotal in deciding who is on what committee in Congress. They will also be deciding, where bills go, what committee those bills go on, assigning bills to be voted on and debated. And that process we'll be talking about in another video. But ultimately, this Speaker of the House is kind of like a filter, and that's really important for bills. If the Speaker of the House does not feel like a bill needs to go to a committee to be voted on and discussed and debated, it just doesn't go. And another important aspect of the Speaker of the House is that they are second in line to succeed the president after the vice president. So according to the 25th Amendment, if the president is unable to serve, then it's the vice president and then Speaker of the House. So we have never really gotten to that point, but there is definitely some weight to that position. Okay, let's move into majority and minority leaders in the House. Now, these leaders are known as also floor leaders. The floor is where all of the conversation and debate and action happens in Congress. So these leaders will lead debate among their parties, right? Whether it's the majority party at the time or the minority party. And they're in charge of guiding discussion from their side of the aisle or their ideology, right? So when they're discussing a bill, they are the first speakers to be recognized in a debate by the Speaker of the House. The Speaker will turn to them first to kind of open things up when they have the floor, first to talk, and they're going to kind of lead the way in terms of their party's wishes. They're going to be the ones to communicate their complaints, their positives about whatever bill is being discussed. And in recent years, they've really kind of become the spokespersons for the party. You'll see a lot of, the majority and minority leaders in the media. In the news, for example. The Speaker of the House will also look to these leaders when it comes to making committee assignments and scheduling bills that will eventually, potentially make it to the floor for that debate. And eventually, hopefully for the bill itself, the voting of the bill for the entire House of Representatives. Now, below the leaders, whether it's the majority or minority leader, we have the House Majority and Minority Whips. I know it's kind of a strange name, but the whips are in charge of party discipline, and essentially their job is to keep a tally of votes among party members. So they're looking like, okay, we have this many seats in our party, who's voting in what way, who might be on the line, who's kind of wavering between voting for or against a bill. They might be looking at individuals in the House, who might be trying to vote outside of party lines. And they're going to try to encourage those party members who might be wavering or on the fence to vote with the party. So it's kind of like strong-arming them to kind of vote in line with the party itself. One of the things they might offer, for example, is favors, endorsements during elections, just to try to have that persuasive influence for that representative. And, that can be enticing because representatives are up for re-election every 2 years. Now, whips are also going to keep track of their party members and make sure that they're in good standing, meaning they're acting ethically. Whips technically have the ability to even ask a member to step down or leave Congress themselves, whether that person will or not, but they do have quite a bit of sway in keeping their members in line. Now, I'm going to go back to this hierarchy slide here in just a moment. Okay. So when it comes to the way that the Senate's hierarchy is set up, you'll notice that aside from these two positions at the top, the ones in the Constitution, this bottom section is really the same. You've got majority and minority leaders, you've got your whips, and then you also have your caucuses and conference chairs as well. The reason why there is such a similar structure between the House and the Senate boils down to the framers setting this up on purpose to be an example of checks and balances between the two chambers, to kind of facilitate that cup versus saucer metaphor that we talked about in 7.1, right? There's supposed to be that kind of additional layer to the lawmaking process to make sure that things are being thought out properly. So this aids in that. There is a similar procedure or process in both. So the only difference really between the two chambers comes to kind of the top of the leadership structure when it comes to vice president and president pro tempore. So, wrong one. Okay, so let's get into the Senate leadership positions, and we're going to start with the vice president. Now, the Senate is predominantly presided over by the vice president according to the Constitution. They are known as the president of the Senate. They are considered a non-voting member, however. The only stipulation with that is if there is a tie. So technically, the vice president, who currently, of course, is J.D. Vance, is currently the 101st member of Congress or the Senate, but again, only voting if there is a tie. And in fact, they're really never there. They're mostly going to be delegating responsibility of presiding over the Senate and monitoring debate to other members of the Senate. And specifically, that often falls to a member that is known as the president pro tempore. The president pro tempore is that final position that's listed in the Constitution. They're going to be, as I mentioned, presiding over the Senate in the absence of the vice president. And, something to think about, too, as we're looking at, the line of succession to the presidency with that 25th Amendment, the vice president or president of the Senate is right after the president if they were unable to serve. Then it goes to the Speaker of the House, and then it comes back to the president pro tempore of the Senate. They are what we consider to be third in line. So right now that is Chuck Grassley, who is a Republican from Iowa. Now, the president pro tempore is technically an honorary title. It's kind of more ceremonial. They don't really have a ton of power. Really, it's just the senior most member of the majority party. And when I see senior member, I don't always mean the oldest. It's just the person who has been in the Senate the longest. So Chuck Grassley is the, like I said, current pro tempore. He has been in the Senate since 1981. So that is how he earned the title of president pro tempore. Okay, so now majority and minority leaders of the Senate, there is a lot of similarity between them and their House counterparts. One thing I want to note, though, and why there is a star here next to majority leader, the Senate majority leader does have quite a bit of sway in the Senate. And this is because of the absence of the vice president most of the time and the largely honorary ceremonial title of the president pro tempore. they have quite a bit of sway when it comes to the legislative agenda, when it comes to the policy-making process. They're kind of the real quote-unquote official leader of the Senate. They are the first recognized when it comes to debate in the Senate. They're going to be responsible for setting the legislative calendar in the Senate. So they're kind of similar like the Speaker of the House. They're going to decide which bills go to debate, which do not, which committees they get assigned to. They also guide the party caucus on issues and proposals as well. So they do definitely have quite a bit of power compared to the House counterpart. Now, the Senate Minority Leader does very similar things, just not to the extent of the Majority Leader. Now, I know this, I don't have anything really here for the Majority and Minority Whip in the Senate and the caucus and conference chairs. They are essentially the same as their House counterparts. Okay, so the next thing we're going to start looking at is the first step of the lawmaking process, and that is going to be committees. We're going to take a look at what, committees are used for, what types of committees exist, ones that are specifically, exclusive to just the House of Representatives, what role these leaders play when it comes to committees. So first things first, let's get an overview of committees, and let's talk about the purpose of them, and that is to break down the work that happens in Congress, the work of lawmaking itself. When you think about the sheer number of representatives that are in Congress, right? And that includes representatives in the House and senators. There are 535. So in order to actually get things done, you have to break down and divide the workload, right? It's easier with a smaller group of people to get things done, to come to a consensus. You can be more efficient. You can tackle tougher issues, draft more precise legislation. Imagine if the entire House of Reps would have to get together and write a bill. That would be an insane task with 435 different interests. Committees also allow Congress to specialize their focus. Congress comes into office, right? Everybody has their own backgrounds. Some people come with law backgrounds, some with business, some in education, for example. So Congress, then these committees allow them to have an opportunity to specialize, to become an expert in a field and contribute to that specific committee. Committees are also where most of the process of lawmaking takes place. There's also subcommittees where details, and when I say details, I mean very, very specific details of laws are decided. And this is that hallmark of the lawmaking and legislative process. Something else that committees allow Congress to do to break down the work is also oversee how executive agencies administer the laws that Congress creates. And this goes back to Unit 5, when we talked about the bureaucracy and the executive branch. This is that action of legislative or congressional oversight, right? So something that committees will be tasked with is overseeing an agency. So one that we might all be familiar with is TSA, or the Transportation Security Administration. With what will happen is Congress, a specific committee, will ultimately oversee that agency to make sure it's doing its job of inspecting airline passengers and their belongings, to monitor safety through airplane travel. Now, committees are more important in the House than the Senate, and the reason for that is, as we've mentioned multiple times so far this unit, is size, right? When the House is much larger with 435 members versus the Senate's 100. So you have to have more committees, or at least more rules, to make sure that things are getting done effectively and efficiently, that we're not reaching gridlock. And committees are ultimately really influenced heavily by the political party in charge, right? That majority, as well as the congressional leadership of that party. The party leaders that we just went through are the ones deciding who is placed on what committee a bill will go to, who the committee chairpeople or chairperson is. They're also responsible for scheduling bills out of committees, as we'll see in the next video. And it's very possible that bills never make it out of committees. In fact, a lot of bills, most bills actually, will die, or so to speak, in a committee and never make it to debate. Now, the committee chairperson is also very important in this. They are usually chaired by a senior or experienced member of the majority party, and the majority party holds the majority seats on each committee. So therefore, that majority party has control then over the flow of legislation, right? What bills end up making it to the floor of each chamber for actual debate. Now, something else, just as an overview, not all committees are really considered equal. Senators and representatives do want to be placed on committees that have more power. Some committees do have more at stake. So, for example, in the House of Representatives, there is something called the Ways and Means Committee, which we'll look at shortly. This is ultimately responsible for something that is solely a House power, which is revenue bills. All representatives would like to have an influence on that specific power of taxing and spending and revenue. So there is power that comes with being placed on a specific committee. And in addition, what you come into Congress with in terms of your experience and expertise will also, influence your committee assignment. Okay, so let's talk about specific types of committees. So first of all, a standing committee is going to be a permanent committee. They are focused usually on a particular focus area, particular policy area, and this is what allows Congress and the committee to specialize on a few topics. So an example of a standing committee would be, there's one in the House that's the Energy and Commerce Committee. This committee has authority on utilities, gasoline, business matters. So as you can see, that's a very focused topic, and they will focus on writing legislation, drafting bills on that particular policy area itself. Oops. The second type of committee is a joint committee. A joint committee is composed of members of both houses. Usually joint committees focus on taxation, they focus on the economy, and yes, I know taxes and revenue, those have to start in the House according to the Constitution, but of course the Senate will want to say on those type of bills. So a joint committee will be formed to discuss those. There are also select committees, and these are temporary. Unlike our standing or joint committees, these handle particular issues or even investigations, right? So a famous example with Watergate, when that was happening with Richard Nixon, a select committee was established to investigate that. In 2012, there was a select committee to investigate some terrorist attacks that happened in Benghazi, in Libya. There was a select committee established to investigate January 6th. So they're temporary. There's really no guidelines as long as it's a particular issue that's temporarily investigating something. And then we also have conference committees, which we'll definitely take a look at again in 7.3. But just as an overview, they are responsible for resolving disputes and differences between bills that are passed between the House and Senate. And this is a type of joint committee. Representatives and senators will join this committee, and their task is to kind of create a compromise bill that will then be sent to the president for signature. Now, Congress can also be organized into conferences and caucuses. These are not specifically committees. Committees like these four tend to be very formal. Conferences and caucuses are more informal. Not necessarily governmental groups, but they do contain like-minded people. And usually that means individuals united around a particular belief. So oftentimes what we see is that in each chamber, the Republican Party will caucus or conference. Likewise, the Democratic Party will do the same thing. And that will include the entire party membership within that chamber. So for instance, in the Senate, The entire Democratic Party is a part of the Democratic Party caucus. Same with the House and vice versa. And, this is where at the beginning of the video, when I mentioned we're deciding on, leadership in the House and Senate, that's where this happens. That's where agendas are set for each party. That's where committee members will be assigned. And there are also smaller conferences and caucuses, usually more specific. So things like agriculture and business, women's issues. Something to note with these conferences and caucuses, the Senate is actually able to build longer lasting coalitions and groups because of the fact that they have longer terms. They're in power longer. They don't have to worry about re-election as frequently as the House, whereas the House will tend to be a little bit more fluid when it comes to these organizations, their conferences and caucuses. So here's an overview photo. There are many, many committees in the House and in the Senate. There are 20 standing committees in the House, 15 in the Senate. You can see, economics, printing, taxation, joint committees. It's just an overview of what the House and the Senate have in terms of standing, select, and joint committees. Now, there are a few committees that are specific to the House of Representatives due to its size that I need you to know. The first is the Ways and Means Committee, and this deals specifically with tax policy. According to the Constitution, all revenue has to start in the House of Representatives, and this committee is the one that deals with any issue dealing with taxation. In particular, raising or lowering income taxes would be an example of something that the Ways and Means Committee would discuss. The second is the Rules Committee, and the Rules Committee was created due to the size of the House of Representatives, and this is what really makes the process the most efficient in a lawmaking chamber that size. Their main task is to assign bills to the appropriate standing committee. Ultimately, the Rules Committee in the House impacts every single bill that goes through the House of Representatives. They have to review the bill. They will decide which committee it goes to. They will schedule the bill for debate, so they definitely work with the Speaker of the House on this. It goes to the Rules Committee to decide when a vote for a bill will take place, if at all. So it definitely has quite a bit of power. And as we will see, this also sets the guidelines for debate, including how much time a bill can be debated, how many representatives can debate a bill, how much or how many amendments or changes may be added. We're going to get into something called germane amendments, for example. So sometimes the Rules Committee is going to come in and say that any changes made to a bill have to relate specifically to the legislation under consideration. It has to be the same topic. Now, that is not necessarily a requirement in the Senate, so we'll definitely see the difference there when we get into that process in 7.3 in the next video. And this Rules Committee is very, very powerful. It's very easy for the Rules Committee to simply just dispose of a bill or even define guidelines that would cause the defeat of the bill before it makes it to the floor of the House to vote. So I always think of the Rules Committee more as kind of like a traffic cop of the House floor, right? Nothing gets to the floor for debate unless the Rules Committee allows it. Now, usually the Rules Committee will reflect the will and beliefs of the House leadership, the majority caucus or conference, for instance, because as we said, the majority party has the majority of seats in these committees. So whatever party is in charge, they kind of have their agenda, their rules, and they see to it that those bills will get put through first. Now, a final committee specific to the House is the Committee of the Whole. Now, this is not common, but it is unique to the House of Representatives. As a basic overview, this is designed to allow for longer debate in the House of Representatives. And what it does is ultimately allow for debate among fewer people. So ultimately, instead of voting individually, right, all 435 representatives having a separate vote, the committee of the whole will unite the House into various groups, and these groups of members will then vote as a whole, as a group, so to speak. So this allows for more debate to happen since the voting itself has, to take less time. Okay, so that covers committees. We are going to see the role that committees play a little bit more in depth in 7.3 when we really get into lawmaking. So stay tuned for that section of the lawmaking process. If you guys have any questions, make sure to jot them down in your notes. Let me know in the Ed puzzle. And I look forward to clarifying anything for you in class. So have a great day. Bye, guys.